Columbus on Trial, presented on Indigenous Day, a holiday formerly known but still observed by some as Columbus Day, but also honored by others as Indigenous Day. This is Columbus on Trial. Foreigner on the island. Purpose of the presentation is to prove that Christopher Columbus, credited by historians for being the leader of the Spanish Conquest, was not even Spanish at all, did not have Spanish interests, or loyal to the Spanish nobles, crown, and empire. It's also to highlight the people and places in the Caribbean that Columbus was accepted and praised, and also those that opposed and went to war with him. To bring to light hidden and overlooked facts about the Spanish conquest of Hispaniola regarding Columbus, Spaniards, and the natives. To create a new perspective to old narratives concerning those with Spanish and native ancestry in the Americas. It was a very complicated conquest. On both sides, on all sides actually, it was not a monolith, one side versus the other side situation. And before Columbus stepped foot into the New World, we know there were already pre-existing wars between the Taínos and Caribs. And when Columbus landed in 1492, he merely just plotted to divide and conquer. So when Christopher Columbus arrives on the northwestern region of the island, he finds the very hospitable Taínos led by this cacique named Guacanagari. This particular cacique took Columbus in and was very hospitable and served Columbus' needs. And as you can see on this map here, provided by Yale University Genocide Studies Program, it shows where Columbus first arrived on the island. This is where Columbus got his intel in terms of the layout of the island, the politics of the island, where the wealth was, where the other competing tribes were. So this might have been a situation where both the cacique and Columbus might have used each other for political means, being the fact that the island was already divided by some caciques and some had higher status than others. And this might have been a way for this particular cacique to move up in that ladder. Who knows? And this might have been a mutual situation, a mutual benefit between Columbus and this particular cacique. So it says here, Columbus was received by the native cacique Guacanagari, who gave him permission to leave some of his men behind. Columbus left 39 men, including the interpreter Luis de Torres, and founded the settlement La Navidad. We don't want to overlook these facts in terms of his interpreter, Luis de Torres. It says here, according to Samuel E. Morrison, who wrote a book titled The Admiral of the Ocean Sea, A Life of Christopher Columbus. Here he says Torres spoke Hebrew, some Arabic. These languages were believed to be the mother tongue of all languages. These are interesting facts because Columbus is traveling with an interpreter speaking Hebrew and Arabic. So this brings up some questions. Why not bring someone to interpret the languages of India and Asia? Question number 2, did Columbus already know Moors and Jews were already occupying India? These were the languages of the Moors and the Jews. Did he expect to somehow meet the Moors and the Jews of India? And for Luis de Torres to be such a valued interpreter and person to Columbus, why was he left behind? Luis de Torres is in a position to gather some very important information in terms of the linguistics of the local population. The only other languages that he would need for this particular trip would be the languages of the Spanish and those of the native Arawaks on the island. But I'll leave that to the imagination. or Guacanagarics, allowed Columbus to establish the settlement of La Navidad near his village. The colonists that remained there were killed by a rival tribe before Columbus returned on his second voyage. And according to some sources, it says here, there had come to Hispaniola from the south and southeast a black people who have the tops of their spears made of a metal which they call guanin. If you're saying that the gold might be on the southeast of Marion, then that will put you right there where Caonabo and the Maguana region is, and where the gold was and was being mined. Cacique Caonabo, who was the king of the island and had the gold on the island, this is where the gold was being produced back then. And this is where gold is still being produced to this day, right now. Not every native or aboriginal was friendly with Columbus. There were some that opposed his occupation and went to war with him. And the tribe that was responsible for this was the Sagayos. When Columbus came on his second voyage, this was that blitz of Columbus where he came with reinforcements, with many ships and many soldiers, and this would cause the capture of the king of the island, of the cacique, King Caonabo. And this is what led to the theft of gold and the enslavement of the natives. Many of these things were documented by Las Casas and other historians, known as the destruction of the Indies. So we know these things were documented by Las Casas, and where they brought great devastations to the native population and hands and limbs being chopped off. But like I said, the natives were not the only victims of these crimes. It says here, during his brief reign, Columbus executed Spanish colonists. Hold up, let's read that again. During his brief reign, Columbus executed Spanish colonists for minor crimes. So it says here, Columbus executed Spanish colonists for minor crimes and used dismemberment as another form of punishment. Remember, these were things we were told that were only happening to the Indians. So the images of these people being hung, and limbs being chopped off as documented by Las Casas, these things were happening to the Spaniards. Let's read on. By the end of 1494, disease and famine had claimed 2/3 of the Spanish settlers. Hold up right there. So on his second voyage, we're seeing who are the victims of the disease and famine, and who are being dismembered and who are being executed for minor crimes. It was the Spaniards. Throughout all these events, certain Spanish nobles were stepping up and going against Columbus. Columbus charged for his crimes. Francisco Rodan went to war with Columbus and his brothers. Francisco teamed up with the North Coast Caciques in La Vega and Mocha. These were regions on the island where Spanish nobles and caciques were teaming up with each other. Whereas Columbus had his loyal cacique with him, Francisco Rodan had his own loyal natives with him. According to the records, Francisco Rodan called Columbus a foreigner and was accused of having no interest in the glory of Spain. These were charges that we have to consider in terms of viewing Columbus as some sort of leader of the Spanish conquest. He claimed Columbus wanted to enslave Spaniards. What? Columbus was charged for killing Spaniards. We just learned that. He was hanging them on that second voyage where he came with all those reinforcements, where we thought maybe he was coming with Spaniards. Maybe he was not coming with Spaniards, because it would not make sense to come with a ship full of Spaniards only to arrive in Hispaniola to hang Spaniards. We have to now relook and rethink this history now. Who did Columbus arrive with if he's on the island hanging Spaniards? They ended up putting Columbus and all his goons in chains and was charged officially. But let's go back to this concept of Columbus enslaving Spaniards. That's something we haven't heard yet, or maybe we heard and just overlooked it. Columbus charged for his crimes. A quote from The Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus by Washington Irving, Volume 2, 1882. This book was written. Chapter 4, Conspiracy of Rodin, during 1497. In the 5th paragraph, Irving writes, he, meaning Francisco, hinted that the true reason was the fear of the Adelantado, meaning Columbus, and his brother Bartholomew, lest accounts should be carried to Spain of their misconduct, and he affirmed that they wished to remain undisturbed as masters of the island. That's Francisco talking about Columbus and his brothers, how they just wanted to remain on the island undisturbed as the masters of the island. And of course, Francisco was not having that. And he says he wanted to keep the Spaniards as subjects, or rather as slaves. So this is Columbus wanting to keep the Spaniards as slaves. This is very interesting here, because we have accounts of not only Spaniards being hung, decapitated, limbs being chopped off, killed, but we have accounts of Columbus wanting to enslave Spaniards. Now this is very interesting, because we remember of those other sources of Columbus shipping captives out of the island and into Europe. So were Spaniards also part of those captives? And where were they being shipped to? Now, being charged with all these crimes comes with its consequences. So, as we see here, it says Columbus was put in chains and arrested by the Spanish crown, stripped of his wealth and title as governor, and denied entry into Santo Domingo by his 4th and final voyage. He avoided the North Coast completely for his 3rd and 4th voyages. And it says Columbus finds no friends or support in Spain. Isabella turns her back. He returns with orders not to enter Hispaniola. So as you can see here, Queen Isabella has that look of disappointment. It seems like Queen Isabella was the only one who was pulling for Columbus. But once Columbus proved to be someone who was not to be trusted and causing damage and destruction and taking wealth and gold for himself, Queen Isabella realized that he was not the person he presented himself to be. Columbus found refuge with the natives on the west end of Hispaniola, what we call Haiti, Cuba, and Jamaica on the final trip. He found acceptance and impresses the locals with knowledge of the stars. On August 14th, Columbus landed on the mainland of the Americas at Puerto Castilla near Trujillo, Honduras, on his final stops before heading back to Europe. So these are interesting connections. Or, is there a connection between Columbus and the word Trujillo? Things that we can connect between Rafael Trujillo and Christopher Columbus. There's some comparisons here. Both were connected to this word Trujillo. Trujillo was one of the final destinations of Columbus, and Rafael Trujillo, not only is his surname, but his family has connection to these towns as well. Both having false Spanish identities. Case with Rafael Trujillo and his claims of a pure Spanish background come into question. We know there's some mixtures with some French and some Haitian ancestry, so we know he tried to portray this pure Spanish blood, which we know he did not have. And they had some Italian connections in terms of his administration. And the same with Columbus. For a long time, since Columbus was associated with the Spanish Conquest, we've kind of swept under the rug that Columbus himself was not even Spanish, and he himself had Italian connections. So that's the one thing that both he and Trujillo both share. Another thing, they both stole from the island, caused wars and massacres, and both had ties and connections to the west end of the island. Finally, they both had problems with the residents and natives of the North Coast. So interesting connections there between Rafael Trujillo and Christopher Columbus regarding this word, this term, Trujillo. Columbus the foreigner. What have we learned? Number one, that Luis de Torres spoke Arabic and Hebrew, but was left behind. Number two, some Tainos in the Caribbean sided with Columbus, and there were some Caribs that opposed him. So we know the Caribs also possessed the guanin, the gold of the island. And number four, Columbus hanged, murdered, and possibly enslaved Spaniards. He is lifted up as some kind of leader of the Spanish Conquest when the Spanish crown themselves did not even recognize, respect, or acknowledge his authority at all. Number five, Columbus avoided the north coast of Hispaniola, and he was denied entry into the island on his fourth voyage. It looked like he was in a desperate state towards his final years. He took refuge in Cuba, did some magic tricks, or showed some of his knowledge of the stars to woo the locals and the natives to win favor over them, and it appeared like it worked. And he took a final trip to Trujillo, Honduras, a place called Trujillo, Honduras. We know there's a Trujillo in Mexico, there's a Trujillo in Peru, there's also a Trujillo in Puerto Rico and in other places. So this word Trujillo looked like it's far spread out throughout the Americas. But one thing that has to be really investigated is whether or not this place already bear the name when Columbus arrived in this particular region in Honduras, or if he named it, or maybe a Spanish noble named it prior to his arrival. These things were not really fully explained in the accounts. So if you're someone of Spanish ancestry, or Latino, or identify Hispanic, or Latino, Afro-Latino for that matter, these are things that have to concern you, because this is also part of your history. Were some of those people he was hanging maybe part of your ancestors? What side of history were your ancestors were? So with that, folks, we want to end it there. Thanks for your time. This is your brother David Rodriguez with another presentation of Hispaniola History Channel. This is Columbus on Trial. Peace and good night.
This is the Hispaniola History Channel, La Historia de Hispaniola, presented by David Rodriguez.